In this video lesson, we'll explain how Britain's colonists became embroiled in the home country's war with France, and we'll describe the colonists' role in the 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian War, and indicate the consequences of the French defeat for the Americans. George Washington inaugurates war with France. By the 1750s, the Ohio Valley was the scene of a conflict that was very heated and violent between France and England. France considered the Ohio River Valley an important link between Canada and their claims in the lower Mississippi. Americans valued the Ohio Valley for westward expansion and for the fur trade, and they were very concerned that the French were trying to take the land away from them and were giving them competition when it came to the fur trade. And they were willing to fight for it and fight for their security. In 1749, the Ohio Company, which was formed by Virginia land speculators, secured legal rights to nearly 500,000 acres in this region, and the Washingtons were among one of their investors. To complicate matters, France had been constructing a string of forts commanding the strategic Ohio River, including Fort Duquesne, which was a bastion built at the confluence where the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers connected. In 1754, Virginia's governor ordered Colonel George Washington, a very young colonel, to lead about 150 militiamen into the Ohio River Valley and to secure the Ohio Company's claims. His forces met French soldiers in the forest 40 miles from Fort Duquesne and attacked them, igniting a bloody war in America and Europe for control of North America. Washington's militiamen, unable to escape to Virginia, built a fort called Fort Necessity before being surrounded by French troops on July 4, 1754. Washington was forced to surrender on this date against hopeless odds and was paroled with full honors. This is a picture of a young George Washington. Thus began the French and Indian War, started by George Washington and fought as an undeclared war for 2 years before widening into what's called the 7 Years' War. In 1755, British officials in Nova Scotia rounded up approximately 4,000 French Acadians and deported them as far south as Louisiana, where they became known as Cajuns. This picture here that you can see is the picture of Fort Necessity, built by General Washington as he was being surrounded by French troops in the Ohio River Valley. This is actually currently built in an area that is now present-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The French and Indian War, unlike previous wars involving the American colonists, started in America and not in Europe, which was the result of Washington's fight with the French near Fort Duquesne. At its height, the war had expanded to the West Indies, to Africa, to the Philippines, and to Europe, where it became known as the 7 Years' War. In Europe, England, and Prussia, they all faced off against France, Spain, and Austria and Russia in a bloody war where the opposing armies often outnumbered English and Prussian soldiers 3-1. The bloodiest fighting occurred in Germany, where Frederick the Great achieved a historic victory, which sapped France's manpower and prevented her from sending more troops to North America. In 1754, British officials convened at the Albany Congress in New York. The purpose of the Albany Congress was to create a greater unity among the 13 colonies and to keep the Iroquois nation and confederacy loyal to England, so that England had Native American support because France already had allies that were Native Americans. Benjamin Franklin presented his Albany Plan of Union to delegates of the 7 colonies that attended, but there was a very low attendance, and the Congress actually rejected his plan, demonstrating only marginal unity among Americans, and they weren't very unified at this time. They were mostly a loose union of states. Parliament also rejected Franklin's Albany Plan of Union because it delegated legislative authority to colonial governments, and it would have established what was called colonial home rule in America, which Parliament did not want. Before the Albany Congress convened, Franklin had published his most famous cartoon of the era in what's a newspaper called the Pennsylvania Gazette. And the first political cartoon you can see here. We'll talk about the meaning of the political cartoon a little more in class when we meet. In 1755, General Braddock led a British army, supported by American militia under Colonel Washington, into the Ohio River Valley to capture Fort Duquesne. General Braddock, ignoring Washington's advice, tried to cross the Monongahela River at a spot that was considered very likely for an ambush. French troops and their Indian allies basically did ambush them in this area as the Redcoats were attempting to cross, killing Braddock and routing the entire British force. This was a defeat that basically inflamed the entire colonial frontier from Pennsylvania to North Carolina. Savage Indian attacks became rampant along the frontier and spread colonial militias very thin. British officials were offering bounties for English scalps. So things were definitely deteriorating between the British and the Native Americans. In 1765, Britain undertakes a full-scale invasion of Canada using a strategy of multiple attacks against widely scattered French fortresses, which were located between the Ohio River Valley north to Quebec and Montreal. This early strategy failed because Britain's military power was not focused. It exposed the armies to a succession of separate defeats. Had Britain focused its power on Quebec or Montreal first, it would have forced French armies in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys to withdraw into Canada because of lack of supplies or reinforcements. In 1757, these defeats led to the installation of a man named William Pitt, who was called the Great Commoner, and he became Britain's new prime minister. William Pitt, who is pictured here, was a gifted leader, much admired by commoners. He radically transforms Britain's military strategy, focusing British military power against French assets in the Quebec and Montreal region of Canada. Pitt orders an all-out assault on Fort Louisbourg, guarding the sea, approaches to the St. Lawrence River. After a 2-month siege, it fell to British forces and gave England its first victory of the war. Pitt then ordered General James Wolfe, a daring young officer, to assault French forces commanded by the Marquis de Montcalm at Quebec. In a daring night move and a sneak attack, Wolfe's army scaled a cliff, protecting Quebec's flank, which was a maneuver that enabled his entire force to assemble on what was called the Plains of Abraham, outside the fortress. The ensuing Battle of Quebec in 1759 ranks as one of the most significant military engagements in British and American history. It's a battle which led to the end of France's North American Empire. During the battle, both opposing commanders were mortally wounded, but Wolfe's victory opened the way for a final assault against Montreal in 1760. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris is signed to end the French and Indian War. As a result, France is forced to cede most of Canada, all of the Ohio River Valley, and the eastern half of the Mississippi River Valley to England, which was a historic moment and marked the end of France's empire in North America. To compensate Spain for its losses, France ceded all of Trans-Mississippi Louisiana and the port city of New Orleans to their loyal ally. The treaty also provided that England would return possession of Cuba to Spain in return for Spanish Florida. England emerges from the French and Indian War as the dominant power in North America and the master of the seas. You can see on this map that the French basically at this point are going to give up all of their North American land, and the British are going to gain tremendous areas while other lands are ceded to Spain.